Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first meeting of the Bibliographical Society of 2021. We're delighted to have as our speakers this evening, Alison Walker and Alice Wickenden. Alison Walker was a curator at the British Library for many years. Her interest in Sir Hans Sloane's library began in the 1980s when working on named collections at the British Library, and later when specific identifying stamps were added to bindings on Sloane books. Since retiring from the British Library in 2008, she has been working on the Sloane Printed Books project and its associated database. Sloane's approximately 45,000 volumes of printed material were not kept together, but mingled with other collections. And in addition, many were disposed of as duplicates between 1787 and 1820. The project has identified Sloane's books at the BL and elsewhere and created an online catalogue. Alice Wickenden is a collaborative doctoral partnership student with the English department of Queen Mary University of London and at the British Library. Entitled Hans Sloane's Library and its Material Connections, her thesis looks at the grey areas of a library collection, and fascinatingly asks how, when, and why a line is drawn between book and object, library and museum. She's recently published pieces in the Inscription Journal and in Publishing History. So, Alison and Alice, I'm delighted now to invite you to speak to us.
Thank you very much, James. Sir Hans Sloane had a large and diverse collection of objects, specimens, manuscripts, and books. Today, we can see its contribution to the history of science, to the history of antiquarianism, and how it reflects Sloane's contemporary knowledge networks. However, it can be seen to display attitudes to cultures and ethnicities which we may not share. Recent changes in the display of Sloane's image throw light on his relationship to slavery, both at the British Library, where words of explanation now appear below this bust, and at the British Museum, where there is clarification along a display of his artifacts. The Jamaican sugar plantations, earlier owned by his wife's first husband, were certainly a major source of his income. Yet his own account of his time in Jamaica shows that he willingly used his medical skills to treat slaves, and within his collection he preserved important examples of African and Jamaican culture. Objects and books do, of course, have lives before and after entering a collection, and they're not necessarily seen now as they were when they were collected. But rather than attempt to further analyse this cultural context, this talk will focus on a purely bibliographical project, the rediscovery of Sloane's books, which we will look at separately from the many other parts of his collection. And I have to apologise here that work on this project was frozen by COVID-19 lockdown. Otherwise, I would have been able to see more about our findings and offer more images. I hope to prepare a more extended article on the project to appear next year. Born in Ireland in 1660, Hans Sloane left home at the age of 19 to study medicine, botany, and natural sciences in London. He then studied in Paris and took his degree in France. Between 1686 and 1689, he travelled to Jamaica as personal physician to the Earl of Albemarle. He was building up a library as early as 1680, and in Jamaica, he acquired specimens and curiosities. On return to London, he set up practice as a physician. In 1695, he married Elizabeth Langley, the wealthy widow of a Jamaica planter. His long career as a physician and man of science, during which he was president of the Royal Society and of the College of Physicians, was accompanied by an ever-expanding collection of books, manuscripts, botanical specimens, and natural and artificial curiosities. He died in 1753. His will included a list of the categories in his collection. These ranged through 23,000 kinds and medals, 5,439 insects, 1,421 corals, 200 volumes of dried plants, and 55 mathematical instruments. Books and manuscripts together were estimated at 50,000 volumes. These collections were sold to the nation for £20,000, much less than their market value, and became one of the foundation collections of the British Museum. The collection has not always been seen as an accumulation of knowledge. It was also seen by a contemporary as a collection of gimcracks. Recently, however, there has been a greater recognition of the place of the collection, both historically and within the institutions which now hold his materials. Not everything survives. Specimens and objects can be vulnerable, but happily his books have proved quite durable, and today most can be found or identified. The separation of books from his other collections is in a sense artificial, but it reflects the reality of his collections as they are now. During his lifetime, all his materials could be used and consulted alongside one another. Incorporation in the museum, however, meant an immediate distinction by category, as books, manuscripts, specimens, and artifacts were all placed separately. Ideally, of course, a reconstruction of the collection should weave all the pieces into a seamless whole, representing its original state. This was essentially the aim of reconstructing Sloane, a joint project begun in 2010 between the British Museum, the British Library, and the Natural History Museum, the major institutions which hold parts of Sloane's collections. Separately, his correspondence was covered by the Sloane Letters Project, begun by Lisa Smith in 2010. However, the distribution of material between several institutions means that it is still difficult to see the collection as a whole. Much more work and some heroic effort would be needed to achieve this. The ambition of the Sloane Printed Books Project has been relatively modest, and it focuses on one part of the collection, printed books. The Sloane Printed Books Project is a virtual reconstruction of the library as it was in 1753, before it was rearranged and mingled with other book collections within the BM. The reconstruction tries to show firstly what was in the library, but also how it was organized, how it was used, and how acquisitions and possibly disposals were made. The library was built up over a lifetime, a period of 70 years, during which time it saw many changes. Between 1680 and 1753, it developed from being a private collection for study and pleasure to becoming one of greater public significance, and finally recognized by Sloane in his will as a collection which should be maintained for national enjoyment and use. We can see from the project roughly what the library contained at various stages of its development, moving from student textbooks to prestigious high-value items and significant parts of other collectors' libraries. It reflects the man who moved from student to physician to national figure to retired and revered national treasure. Not, of course, that the library was ever complete. In the 1750s, even at the end of his life, Sloane was continuing to collect both contemporary and older material. He never stopped collecting. This project has been a rediscovery as well as a reconstruction. When the library became part of the British Museum, it was not kept in the same arrangement as during Sloane's lifetime. The trustees considered it ill-arranged, and one can understand why they thought this. The museum incorporated the books in new classification schemes alongside other collections. By the early 19th century, it was interspersed with books from the Old Royal Library, other collections, and post-1753 acquisitions. And then the BM held duplicate sales of books between 1787 and 1832, which disposed of a large number of Sloane items. Here we can see stamps on a book which was disposed of in the duplicate sale of 1787, but was bought by Joseph Banks and re-entered the museum with Banks's library. For many years then, Sloane's library was invisible, mingled with other collections at the BM or dispersed elsewhere. Not until 1940 was his manuscript catalogue formally recognised as such, together with the alphanumeric marks he used to locate his books. By the early 1960s, all the volumes of his own catalogue and the separate copy of Lindenius Renovatus, recording his medical books in Latin, had been recognised. Here you see on the right, Sloane manuscript 3972C, which is his manuscript catalogue, and on the left is Lindenius. This project began in the 1980s, following the publication of these discoveries, and accompanied a decision by the British Library to create a special stamp for Sloane books as they were rebound. The stamp was used on bindings from the early 1980s to the mid-1990s. And as they were identified, a database of Sloane's books was gradually built up, and this continued after use of the stamp ended. In 2008, the database was mounted on the BL website and recorded about 14,000 items. Now, 43,000 items have been identified. At Sloane's death, the estimated number of printed volumes in the library was around 47,000. Bibliographical items and volumes are not the same thing, of course. Single sheet publications, or typically slight continental dissertations, have been accumulated into volumes containing up to several hundred items. This means that the total number of items will almost certainly exceed the estimate of 47,000. The aim of this project has been to identify, firstly, books which definitely belong to Sloane and have evidence of his ownership, and so far we've found about 23,000 of these. Then those which probably did belong to him but don't bear conclusive evidence of it, and there are about 12,000 so far. And finally, those of which he owned copies but which have not been located, and so far about nearly 7,000 of these appear on the database. Sloane's books can be identified by his own marks, by the type of British Museum ownership stamp, or by references in his catalogues. There are definite forms of identification: Sloane's signature, his manuscript notes, his purchase code, or his alphanumeric mark. And from now on, I'm going to refer to this as the Sloane number. This probably identifies the book's location in his house. The black octagonal British Museum ownership stamp is evidence of probable but unconfirmed ownership. This is when the stamp appears with no other Sloane identification, such as his number. The stamp itself is not conclusive, since although intended for use specifically on Sloane's books, it continued in use for non-Sloane items in the later part of the 18th century. The presence of both the black stamp and an entry in one of Sloane's catalogues is treated as definite evidence, although theoretically it may not be absolutely certain. Items are marked as unlocated if there is no BL copy, if the BL copy or copies are from other collections, or if they were acquired by the BM or the BL after 1753. Some of these unlocated items have been found in other libraries, and there must be many, many more. But the search for Sloane books elsewhere has not yet been systematic or exhaustive. Perhaps, though, some of you may recognize the marks of Sloane books in your collections, and if so, I would be delighted to know. Here we can see the signature, the Sloane number, and Sloane's code together on a work on astronomical observations published by the French Académie des Sciences in 1693. And here is the entry for the same work on the database. The manicule, or pointing finger referred to, was used by Sloane to highlight items relating to travel. You'll see a post explaining this on the BL's Untold Lives blog. And here is an example of how these manicules appear in Sloane's manuscript catalogue, the little finger marks on the left. To locate Sloane's dispersed books, we began by searching shelves at the BL. The older parts of the library do have a broad subject arrangement, and it was relatively easy to pinpoint areas where Sloane's books might be found in large numbers, given his known professional interests: medicine, botany, natural history. The first stage of the project, therefore, from the early 1990s till about 2015, was to search the shelves in these areas. In this stage, we were able to identify relatively rapidly items with Sloane's number or the octagonal black BM stamp. The second stage, once these areas had mostly been covered, has been to bring Sloane's catalogues into play, using them to identify more items and to add information to existing database entries. We have added Sloane's numbers, many of which no longer survive on the books. The location in Sloane's catalogue, which can indicate a rough date of his acquisition, and described the rearrangement and renumbering, which shows how Sloane managed the collection. Entries have also been made for copies which are no longer in the BL, mostly sold as duplicates between 1787 and 1832. The Sloane database uses British Library records, to which are added his number, reference to his catalogues, the presence of manuscript notes, provenance, genre, and significant bindings. These fields can be searched and combined to show, for example, pharmacopoeias with manuscript notes, annotated sale catalogues, or books previously owned by significant collectors. These records are copied directly from the BL catalogue. Wherever possible, BL records are also used for books in other known locations and for those whose location is unknown, to ensure consistency in the form of name and heading. When there is no BL record, records may be taken from other databases, such as ESTC or JISC. This means that a very small number of records have no equivalent in the BL's catalogue. Let us go briefly through each of the fields used in these records. Normally, the Sloane number takes the form of a letter and a number. Lowercase letters are used for smaller books up to quarto, uppercase for folios, with the one exception of uppercase R, which is used mostly for octavos. A number followed by a colon and a volume number, as in the center of this slide, indicates a periodical. There are special categories such as maps, PR, which means works with prints and engravings, or min, for miniatura, works with colored illustrations. Here is an example of one which was first listed as PR, but reclassed as Min when that category was begun. Usually the Sloan number is allocated to a single item, but collections of slight publications and of single sheets may include large numbers of items with the same Sloan number. The numbers usually appear on title pages or preliminary leaves, but also on paste downs or even on the cover. This seems to have varied according to practicality. There isn't always enough space on a title page, and depending on whether Sloane or one of his amanuenses was marking the books. Now, Sloane's catalogues. Sloane has had several library catalogues, the earliest being a small notebook created between 1686 and 1688. This is a listing roughly in order of date of acquisition. But after Sloane's return from Jamaica, it was superseded, and Sloane manuscript 3972C in 8 volumes was started in 1692. This is the primary catalogue of Sloane's books. You'll see it on the left of this slide. Alongside it, however, there's a heavily interleaved copy of the medical bibliography Lindenius Renovatus, now also in 8 volumes, and that is on the right of this slide. This was used to enter books on medical subjects. Some books appear in both catalogues, but this is probably unintentional. Next, the date and place of purchase. Sloane often recorded the place, the date, and the price of purchase in his books on the title page or on a preliminary leaf. This slide shows how he was marking his books up to 1686, with the place of acquisition, the date, and a coded price. So this is London, 1686, and it cost 1 shilling and 8pence. The Sloane number, Q26, its shelf location was added later. But from 1686 to 1699, this information appears in a different code, recording the purchase date and price. This example, bought in 1686 for 6pence, and F35 on the left in this slide is the shelf location, again added later. This code uses alchemical signs to signify numbers for date and price, and if you want to see these, a full explanation of the codes, it is in the introduction to the database. We can't tell whether all Sloane's books were marked in this way, since so many preliminary leaves have been lost, and the practice of dating acquisitions stopped at a date which roughly coincides with the beginning of Sloane's use of amanuenses to catalogue his books. Next, the binding. Most of Sloane's books are in various kinds of BM or BL bindings. Relatively few, perhaps only 5,000 or so, are still in pre-BM bindings. On some books, Sloane used paper labels marked with his number, typically adhered to the front cover, with the number at the left top and the letter at the left bottom. Occasionally they appear on the title page or on the spine, but few of these now survive. There are fewer than 100 examples of this kind of label on the database. It's difficult to estimate how widespread this practice was, or indeed if it had a particular purpose for particular kinds of books. But we can say that where the label is on the binding is certainly contemporary with Sloane or earlier. Many of Sloane's books came from other collections. In some cases, there's evidence of previous ownership, such as names, annotations, and shelf marks. He probably saw practical information in the manuscript notes left by earlier users, and there are, for example, recipes and remedies in many of them. He probably also valued the legacies of fellow scientists and discoverers and the accompanying prestige of their former ownership. This example is from the Great Library of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, dispersed in the 1730s, to which Sloane has added his own identifier, Bibliotheca Sloanianae, and his number, uppercase L90. And lastly, subject or genre. It would be very useful to map the library by subject, but this has not proved practical as yet. In Sloane's lifetime, there were separately numbered categories such as illustrated books, maps, and periodicals, but there was no formal subject access. The library was arranged principally by date of accession and size. Once in the BM library and interspersed with other collections, his books were distributed among the museum's subject categories, and these can be used now as a rough subject map. It shows, as might be expected, that subjects representing Sloane's professional interests are well covered. The database also has a field for genre, not used consistently, but principally for convenience. It records unusual subjects or languages. Thus, there are entries for beards, bullfights, chess, and the Madagascan language, but there is no structured access. So now that we have accumulated thousands of records for Sloane's books, can we say what was actually in his library? Here are some highlights of what seemed so to me. Others might choose a different focus. Firstly, the breadth of his interests. Science, medicine, and the natural world, of course, but he also had many books on travel, languages, trade and commerce, and a great deal of ephemeral material, such as news sheets and advertisements. On the other hand, there is little literature, plays, or poetry. To illustrate just one of these categories, languages, he had books in or about at least 40 different minority languages, European, North American, and Eastern. Many are vocabularies or manuals for translation, inspired by missionaries, particularly Jesuits, but others, often much rarer, are local vernacular publications. For example, a possibly unique copy of a work on Venetian argot, Nuovo modo di intendere la lingua zerga, published in Venice in 1550, and you can see Sloane's copy on Google Books. And there are some great treasures. Just over 600 15th century editions still in the BL can be associated with Sloane, and a further 85 are no longer at the BL. These include his copy of the Aldine Aristotle, sold as a duplicate in 1805. At the BL, there are Chaucer's 1485 Canterbury Tales and many early medical works, including 4 editions or fragments of Johannes de Quetam's Fasciculus Medicinae. There are highlights too in the BL Maps collection, works by Mercator, Speed, Ogilvy and Speller, books of roads, land maps, sea maps and sky maps, many of them coloured. Perhaps the most visually spectacular volumes are among those classed as PR, i.e. prints, with engraved illustrations, of which there are nearly 600 items, and the Min for miniatura, with hand-coloured plates. Here we find anatomy, descriptions of cities, architecture, portraits, royal processions, emblems, Chinese books, missals, herbals, natural histories, and books of hours. There are highlights among illustrated books of natural history and many illustrated editions of Vesalius's anatomical works. Sadly, though, a disproportionate number of Sloane's illustrated books are no longer at the BL. His copies presumably sold as duplicates when copies from the King's Library or Sir Joseph Banks's collection arrived in the BM. At the opposite end of the scale are ephemera and dissertations. We are lucky that so much of Sloane's ephemera has survived, many are unique copies. He accumulated a great deal of single sheet material, leaving much of it unbound, possibly in boxes or folders. Once in the BM, the sheets were often rearranged and bound by subject. The Sloan catalogue lets us reconstruct some examples of the way they were kept in Sloane's library. The number E52, this is uppercase E52, was used for at least 48 quarto or folio items, and these are now spread across 24 separate BL volumes. They cover a wide range of topics: astronomy, medicine, architecture, news books, petitions to Parliament, and many items concerning trade of various kinds. E53 was an even larger compilation with 78 items recorded on the database, and here the majority, consisting of petitions to Parliament, are still together in the BL, but the collection also contained medical and botanical material, ballads, news sheets, and satire. And then dissertations. Sloane had a huge collection of Continental University dissertations and theses. They are typically slight publications of not more than a dozen pages, perhaps of specialized interest now, but they are worth mentioning simply because he had so many of them. A quick search on the database for text words such as dissertatio or disputatio gives over 4,000 hits. Like the ephemera, they are spread throughout the Sloane's library, often in bound collections. If they were all indexed, we would probably find that there are many hundreds or even thousands more. Most are scientific or medical, and they fit well with his general collecting interests. Not only did he acquire them roughly at the time of publication, and in some cases through personal contacts, as one might expect, but he also bought existing collections, some dating from before he began his library. These would have had biographical and bibliographical as well as subject value. As a result of his methods of acquisition, there are many duplicate copies, up to 6 copies of the same thesis. Sometimes, though, not all the copies listed in his catalogue remain at the BL. Possibly, and quite sensibly, there was some weeding during his lifetime, and certainly many were donated to the Bodleian Library. Others were disposed of in the duplicate sales. And there's little evidence that he read many of them. There are no marks of reading or handling. So is this just Sloane the accumulator? If so, he was certainly successful and had probably had many items which don't survive today in their countries of origin. Another type of accumulation, but one whose purpose is more obvious, is sale catalogues. Sloane had well over 1,000 catalogues from booksellers and auction houses in the UK and Europe, particularly in the 1690s, when he was actively expanding his library. Many are marked by Sloane with potential purchases. Others, like the Dissertations, were purchased retrospectively and probably used as bibliographic tools to identify material of interest. So why did Sloane collect so much? At least at first, much of the library was of practical use. Books of medicine to study, books about the places he visited, books to support his first enthusiasms such as botany, and these subjects continue throughout. There are a large number of books on other interests: language, on foreign countries and habits, on trade and history. For enjoyment, prestige, and to impress visitors, there are beautiful illustrated books. There are books as reference, dissertations, catalogues, newspapers, but there is also sheer accumulation, ephemera, broadsheets, advertisements. Printed material makes up a very significant part of Sloane's collection, and numerically, it's the single largest category, but the historic separation from other materials removes the connectedness that must have been evident during Sloane's lifetime. The printed collections were housed and used alongside other materials. They may contain illustrations of the very objects in his collection, or the objects may exemplify illustrations and descriptions in the books. Books were certainly essential for Sloane's understanding of his objects and specimens, and we should try to think of them together. This talk has merely skimmed across the huge variety and quantity of Sloane's library. A more extensive examination would pay attention to his Chinese and Japanese books, his visual materials, his newspapers, and much more. Our knowledge of Sloane and his collections has grown significantly in the last 80-odd years, and one of the most exciting recent developments in studying Sloane has been the work done by PhD students and student placements. At the BL, we have seen cataloguing work by Shauna Barrett, by my colleague Judith Harrison, and by Tom Roblewski, study of the catalogues by Amy Blakeway, work on historical tracts by Edward Taylor, on natural history books by Lubaba Al-Azami, and currently we have a PhD in progress by Alice Wickenden at Queen Mary, London. Alice is here today and is going to talk about her research on Sloane's foreign language books.
Great, thanks Alison, and thanks also to Clara and to the Bibliographical Society for having me. What follows is going to be a short summary of one of the case studies that I've carried out for my PhD. I came to this topic overall sort of interested in the question of what makes a library. And one of the possible answers that I kept coming back to was readability. Makes sense, right? How important was it for Sloane that the books he bought were in some sense readable? And what does it mean for something to be readable? In this chapter, I decided to look at the things which, although they're ostensibly printed books, they might in certain situations be more easily construed as unreadable objects. I'll spare you from the sort of dense theoretical framing about the differences between readability and legibility, because I thought for the purposes of this, it would be more fun to look at some actual examples, but it'll help to keep in mind this comment of J.D. Fleming's. Reading always occurs in and through the possibility that we may not be able to read what is before us. Legibility is actually necessary to illegibility. Sloane was fairly unexceptional among his contemporaries when it came to language learning. We know that he had fluency in French and Latin, as well as English, because correspondence survives in all three. And presumably he could understand to reading level other common Romance languages he would have encountered, like Italian and Spanish. As John Gallagher reminds us, early modern fluency is a concept that might, in fact, be more helpfully construed as a set of multiple, variable, situational, social competences, rather than a single binary skill to be possessed or not. As Alison sort of mentioned, German is a little bit more ambiguous. There's this huge amount of German medical text in the library, which suggests to my mind that he did have some proficiency in it, but we can't sort of prove it either way. We don't have any correspondence in German. But all of this leads to the first conclusion. Ownership doesn't equal readership, which is very basic, but always worth repeating, I think. So in approaching this, I was working with the starting assumption that if you can't read a book, it's more easily construed as an object. And I think that's a really important way of thinking about it, because it completely challenges the idea that either of those definitions of book or object are anything other than situational. They both rest on the personal abilities of a given individual. The seduction of learning a foreign language, or at least one of them, is its promise to transform the unreadable object into a readable book. So if the same thing has the potential to be both readable and unreadable, or book and object, then its subsequent material classification is also relational rather than inherent. And so what belongs in a library must be similarly relational. That's my sort of theoretical framing. To go about researching this, I was helped by some of these quite specific studies of Sloane's foreign languages, as well as more general writing on the British Library foreign language holdings in question. So by using the Sloane printed books database that's been described, I had a look at some of the places of publication. Clearly, these can't be taken as showing anything about language directly, especially as a lot of the foreign language material that Sloane owned was in fact printed by the Jesuit press in Rome as missionary propaganda. But it was a good starting point to begin to isolate some books with interesting places of publication. Just the next slide shows that you you can see, you can use this to click through on specific holdings and go back to the Sloan database to locate them and have a look. As Alison also mentioned, the genre field has been used to tag particularly unusual subjects and languages. So that was another sort of helpful starting point to begin to narrow down this library and choose books to look at. I also carried out keyword searches for specific languages and on words that indicate a preoccupation with the topic, grammar, dictionary, in their various sort of forms. And all of this helped me produce the shortlist of items to examine. Having drawn up this shortlist, I proceeded to examine the books individually, prioritizing those which can be identified as Sloane's own copies in the process described. I recorded this information in a searchable spreadsheet, which was subcategorized by language, Sloan number, genre, more or less, and date, in the hope of recognizing any larger patterns that might have existed. This was in no way a comprehensive survey of Sloane's foreign language books, but I feel confident that it represents a sort of suggestive variety of the sorts of books he possessed. Where possible, I referred it to John Constantine's appendix to his book, Small Dictionaries of Curiosities, because that has a list of sort of significant publications, so I could understand whether or not Sloane might have owned the first dictionary in that language or a particularly remarkable edition. From the spreadsheet, I identified three main categories of foreign language books that existed in Sloane's library. Were teaching books aimed at the reader who couldn't already read the language, so grammars, dictionaries, phrase books. Foreign language printing that Sloane might have had as an example of the language, but which weren't necessarily printed or written with a sort of interest in the language. That was a byproduct of his possession rather than its existence. And the third category was philosophical texts interested in the ideas of universal languages, or which attempt to theorize language as an object of study in itself. And that latter category and its relationship to the Royal Society and the sort of push towards universal languages is a whole talk in itself. So I'm going to ignore that one for now. So these are some examples of foreign printing. There's a lot of polyglot texts in Sloane's library. This is the Diwi Saweri. The BL catalogue currently notes that this is a Syriac text with a Hebrew transliteration and a Latin translation. The title, as you can see, and the framing devices like headings, subtitles, the introduction are all given in Latin. And so are the majority of the marginal annotations in this copy, although there are some signs of a reader interacting with other languages here, such as this page where you can see they've underlined both the Latin texts, but also the Hebrew at the bottom. Latin is the framing language of this book, which is the term that I've used for the languages that constitute the sort of paratextual supplementary guiding texts for a reader. It's helpful to identify the framing language separately from the language of the core texts, because it's a strong indication of who the target audience for a book might have been. It's paratextual in the sense that it offers a view into the intentions behind the author, publisher, or printer's actions, and it creates, this is Jeanette, between the text and what lies outside of it, a zone not just of transition, but of transaction. There's a sense of alertness that sort of, again, foregrounds the presence of the reader. A book is different depending on who reads it, and the paratext is one of the tools that allows this to be the case. If you compare this page to the spread of pages from the Sanctus Matthäus, the Latin of the title here suggests again that Latin is the book's framing language, but the Latin text on this page is pretty unceremoniously interspersed with the English translation on the left-hand side of the recto page. All languages on that right page use the Roman script, and on the other side we've got these non-Roman alphabets interspersed with Roman ones. But both pages follow the same clearly recognizable pattern. Each column moves between two languages. These are emphasized by difference in typeface and in size, as well as in alphabet. Each column starts with an illustrated drop cap. The second languages begin with a smaller, though still larger than usual, initial. This has several functions. It indicates the direction of reading at a first glance, because we alternate between reading right to left and left to right. But I think it also validates all of these languages as having sort of equivalent weights. Visually, no importance is given to one language over another, although the middle two columns are noticeably wider. What's also interesting is that the catchwords for this book work over the pages as a whole rather than distinguishing between languages. So Liber at the bottom leads into the translation on the next column. It doesn't lead to the column on the sort of corresponding page. The order of languages in the title begins with Syriac, which is in the left-hand corner, crosses the pages from left to right, and then returns to the second rows. All of this, I think, indicates that when setting the type, the printer was viewing the open spread of the pages as a whole, rather than treating the languages as separate. This isn't always the case. The next book is the Massachusetts Palmer Psalter. And this is a more common thing that we see in dual language texts, which is that the catchphrases work within their own languages only. So there are differences. But I think that what these three things can tell us is that there was an interest for Sloane in collecting languages as objects. I don't think that he intended to read these or to use them to sort of learn their languages, but the point of comparison, the fact that they're polyglot texts, help sort of understand the language a bit more as an object of interest. But they're also visual objects that work sort of physically and do this work of making visible and collectible a language as an object within the wider collection. Their possession works not only as books. By owning them, Sloane was possessing the curiosity of the unreadable foreign language and also the potential to lay claim to that knowledge. And I think that would come sort of more into fruition as he began to conceive of his collection as something that would have an afterlife for the nation beyond him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Let's just wind up by looking back. Looking back at Sloane's statue. This is actually in the Chelsea Physic Garden, and he's a bit weather beaten there. Anyway, let's look back over what we've been talking about. In 1994, Margaret Nixon, who then worked in the Department of Manuscripts, said of Sloane, "The study of his library is still in its infancy. Future research is certain to show more and more the extent of the intellectual achievement accomplished by Sloane in its creation." The Sloane Printed Books Project and the other Sloane research projects are taking us further along the road towards an understanding of that achievement. We're not there yet, but perhaps I think we are beyond infancy and we're taking steps toward adulthood. Thank you.